groups. It's interesting, you all have some very good things for all three of these. You've got some direction for what you're going to do. We definitely have some potential issues that we're running into. One of the issues that I heard at all three of the tables was sort of the difference between, or some similarities or differences between what you're thinking about doing or what you're going to do in your research project versus what your cooperating teacher normally does in their classroom. So you might be interested in, go back to the example we used with the middle school playing games. If I want to do a study on playing that game with fractions with my students, and my cooperating mentor teacher never plays games, then part of it is going to be to lay the groundwork to establish kind of the environment in the classroom that is going to be accepting of playing a game, that I can collect the data in the first place. Maybe you want to do something on cooperative learning. If cooperative learning is not part of the classroom culture, then you're going to have to teach the students how to do a little bit of that before you can start to gather the data. So sometimes the research we do plays right into the classroom, and sometimes it's a little harder. That's where action research is actually even easier to do, in a sense, when it is your own classroom. Because you start the year off and you've got a particular environment, a culture that you established with your students, and they expect this. You play games, or you do things in small groups, or you're doing reading circles, or whatever it is, and this is part of what you do normally in your classroom anyway, and all you're doing is researching that to see how well it's working with your students. So sometimes a study like this can almost be kind of culture shock because it's not what the CMT typically does. So that came up in a few cases, and a few little logistical issues that you're working on that you'll have to work out between now and then, but it was interesting to hear that. And then the kind of things that you're really interested in learning about, I was interested in hearing too, that clearly there are some kind of educational issues that you really want to dig into and find more out about. One of the things that we're planning to do in the spring is we'll get together one more time in January to kind of touch base, make sure that we're all on target, etc. And then after the due date of your paper, we're intending to get you back together one more time in April, perhaps with people in the cohort behind you that are in 3160, with you to have an opportunity to share some of the things that you found out, not only in your studies, but also maybe some suggestions you might give to the next group as they enter into the methods and student teaching group. And so we'll have a session sometime in April, so we'll talk more about that later too. Speaking of April, I know if I was in here today, I would probably be asking some questions about exactly when and how is all this stuff going to get done in the spring, and what is my timing here. And so I want to kind of go through a little bit of the timeline with you to so you can see kind of how the student teaching semester plays itself out, because I think everything kind of sort of feeds into itself, and I'm using some of this with some concrete dates that we know about the spring, and also based on what people were able to do last year during spring semester to kind of put that in perspective. So what happens is you come back to campus for the first time on Monday, January 13th. And one question a couple of you have asked me in the last couple of weeks is, do we actually start student teaching the week before that? Is it on that date? And the answer is yes, your schools go back, a lot of the schools go back the week before that on the 6th. Some people even go back January 2nd or 3rd, or where that date is. But you don't actually begin until after the university starts. And our first day back on campus is January 13th. So on that day, assuming the university follows its usual schedule, which is pretty typical, on that Monday the 13th you'll have a student teaching meeting rather than actually being in the field that day. So you have a meeting here on campus that kind of sets the tone and lays everything out. So what happens then is generally the second day of the semester, which is Tuesday, January 14th, is your first day in the field doing your student teaching. The good news about it is for most of you, you'll be in the same placement as you were in the fall. Some of you may change placements, but most won't. When you get out into the field, you will already be somewhat familiar with the school that you're in. And even if you end up changing placements, you could have an opportunity to visit those schools in December, or even that week in January before we come back to school. We have our first, or really our last, 4160 session the Tuesday after that. So we're on the common time schedule, 4:30 to 5:50, and it will be not the first week of your student teaching, but the second week on January 21st. We'll gather to kind of get our ducks in a row. NTPA. Okay, so the TPA due date is going to, that's still under discussion a little bit right now, but I wanted to kind of lay this out to you because this is definitely a change from last year. If you have friends, well, we all had friends that were in methods and student teaching last year, and the TPA wasn't turned in last year until early April. And it really kind of clogged things and got in the way, and we've really streamlined that process and made it very different this year. So the object of, or the idea of the TPA is to get right out in January, get a plan, start to teach, start to collect data, and get the TPA done and off of your desk sooner rather than later. And that way it isn't one of those things that's kind of hanging over your head for weeks and weeks and weeks. We know that you'll have the preparation, you know what needs to be done, and you're going to do your planning, your teaching, videotaping, reflecting, get it uploaded and done. So the deadlines are, they're still under a little bit of discussion because, not really because of what we're doing, but because the TPA, the Pearson folks that grade these, set the due dates for things. And so right now the way that it's set up is AYA, Math and Science. There are due dates on February 20th and March 6th. And right now we're leaning toward this February 20th date. We're not even sure if the March 6th date is going to be an option until we get into the spring. So it's going to be sort of this late February. Those of you who are in middle childhood, the date is the 27th right now that it's set for. So generally speaking, AYA February 20th and middle 27th, but there could be a change then between now and then. So if you kind of count back on your weeks, your first day in the schools on January 14th, and you'll pretty much be in the schools for about 6 weeks before the deadline of turning this in. And that's kind of what we're going to try to do, is to get you to gather your data, write your TPA, get it submitted, it's off your desk. By the time we get to the last week of February, everybody's done with that. Okay? Now, timing-wise for everything else, if you think about that as being kind of a benchmark for student teaching, the work that you will do for this project, for your action research, would then be done pretty much in March and April. We know that the deadline, the capstone paper deadline, is due to your advisors no later than April 15th. So if let's suppose that you submit your NTPA here in the last week of February, you pretty much have about 6 or 7 weeks of a window in there to work on your project for action, which should be plenty of time. I can tell you that last year, these don't have to be separated from one another, so I can tell you that some people last year collected their data during the same time they were working on the TPA, because you don't have to separate them. So, if you're going to, let's suppose you're going to give a pre-test to your class, and go back to that middle school paper we looked at earlier. You don't have to wait until the TPA is done and submitted before you give a pre-test. That could have been done back in January or early February. So if they overlap a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. You may be collecting some data, you might even be teaching part of your unit in February while at the same time as you're finishing up your TPA. They don't have to be separated from one another. So you don't have to think of it as, I'm going to do the TPA first, submit it, be done with it, and then I'll move on and do the capstone project. They may overlap a little bit, they may overlap a lot. And that's totally up to you and your advisor to decide how you want to do that the best. There is enough time in there that you could, from the first day of student teaching, you could spend about 6 weeks making sure that everything's done and turned in on TPA, and still have another 6 weeks to do your capstone project and do them back to back. That's okay. If they overlap, that's okay too. We did have some people last year that did things like this. They would collect their data like in February, overlapping with the TPA, but not actually go through and analyze it and write their paper until later once the TPA is submitted. That's another option. So you can say, I'm going to gather my data, I'm going to do my pre-testing at the end of January and do some teaching and collecting data through March, or through February, but I'm not going to deal with the data until later. I'll get the TPA written up, done, submitted when I get into March. Now I'll go back with that data that I collected back in January and February, and I'll actually analyze it, write it up, and turn it in. So there's a lot of different models here. I just want to make sure that you recognize that there really is plenty of time to do both of those things. We don't want to have you have the burden of walking in the first day and thinking, my gosh, I got all of this stuff and it's due in 3 weeks. You've got really, there's about a 12, 13 week span of time here during which various projects are being done, and you can overlap them or you can do them back to back, and it will work out. And that's really, you're in a much better position than last year's classes were, because last year that TPA due date was in April. So if you can imagine, this date right here was pushed down here into April, and we had a due date here of April, and they were only, the due date for this project and the TPA were within about 10 days of one another. And that's stressful. We didn't want that to happen. But that was the result of the TPA being piloted and having to get into the flow of things before we got to this year. So I think that we fixed that and made it a lot better. So if you've got other friends that are in middle childhood, or you have friends that are in early childhood or special ed, etc., these dates are going to vary by program, but almost everybody's going to have things in by the 1st of March, if not somewhere in late February, so the TPA is done before you get too deep into your student teaching. Okay. Do you have any questions about that? Timeline? Anything?
What do you student teaching though? Like, what's like the last days?
You student teach right through the whole semester, so you finish the week before finals week. So you wrap up like, you will be in the schools through Friday prior to finals week. And then during finals week, they have a student teaching, what is that called? Student teaching forum, conference, something. I can't remember what it's called. But there is a day, it's usually either Monday or Tuesday of the week of finals week, when everybody who did student teaching gets together by program, that you all get together, and there is kind of a student teaching day where there's some keynote speakers and breakout sessions and so forth to kind of process things and get you set up to move on. So that happens during finals week, but you'll actually be in the field from the Tuesday before, or the Tuesday after the semester starts, right through Friday of the last week of the semester. Okay? And remember too that when you're doing your student teaching, you take your break, spring break, when your school takes your break, right? So for most people, the schools breaks are not normally until late March or early April, sometimes around Easter time or whatever. Our spring break here at the university is that second week of March. That's not likely to be your school's break. So you teach right through BG's spring break, and you get a break later when your school takes a break. Any other questions on that? Schedule, timing? You sure, Ellie?
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know how to word it. So.
Okay.
Okay,
Want to
fine.
try?
Okay, for middle childhood people, is there a certain thing, do we have to like teach both content areas at the same time?
No.
Okay.
There are a couple different models that you can follow. Some people will teach both at the same time throughout. Some people will do a heavy science load for half and a heavy math load for half.
Okay.
But I don't think there's any rule that I'm aware of in writing that says you have to teach both subjects at the same time, because I've seen it done different ways.
Okay. Do you know when like the halfway mark is?
Yeah, well, it's actually right around the spring break. So you figure it's
March
of our spring
okay.
break, right? So it's like the 8th of March or something is about 7 or 8 weeks.
So like if I did do like if I did like one first, the other one second, like whatever I do first would be my TPA stuff, and I could get it done and over with.
Yeah.
Before the TPA would be due.
That's right, and actually, I'm glad you asked that, Allie, now that we got to the question, right? Because we had somebody in middle childhood that actually did that last year. And what they did is really focused more heavily on TPA on the front end, and they designed their research project to be done specifically in science teaching that wasn't going to start until after spring break, and then focused it on that. So that's a good way to divide it up, I think. Yep. Anybody else? Okay. So we time on that. So for next time, it's going to be a while. So I need for you to meet with your faculty advisor or mentor at least once between now and the end of the semester, so that you can kind of update them on what we talked about today, where things are at. I think I would really, if I were you, I would really be thinking about this timeline issue. You know, just kind of looking ahead to next semester, take a calendar out, sit down with your advisor and say, what is realistic for when I might collect my data here? Can I do my data collection in January or February, or should I just wait until the TPA is completely off my desk at the end of February? Can we do this whole project from the 1st of March through the middle of April? If so, what's that look like? Can I collect, but come up with a plan so that you know in advance sort of when and how you want to do things, so that it causes the least amount of stress and produces the best product that you can, given all the things that you do next semester. So be sure to meet with them at least once between now and semester's end. Keep an eye on our Canvas community. I've put today's PowerPoint up. I'll load up there anything else that we need. Again, our last session for 4160, it really isn't last session because we'll meet again in April for you to be able to share your results. But I mean, the last session really before you start your project is on the 21st of January. And that's it. Any questions?
My school is an hour away and I don't get out till 4. So for the last session, is it possible to put in that? I don't know if other people said.
My teachers have this in the office.
I'm sorry.
Sometimes my teachers in the office.
I think it's like a problem for middle child.
Yeah.
I'm in an elementary school.
Right. So there's two ways that we can play it. I mean, that's a good question. One way we can play it is to bump the session back a half an hour. The other way is to see if you can get out early a half hour. And actually, last year we did these sessions, we had anybody who had that kind of a conflict, I did not run into any issues with CMTs letting them leave a half hour early on that day.
Okay.
So